The city outside was waking up in shades of grey. Elias lived in a small apartment above a bakery where the scent of yeast was the only thing that made the damp morning bearable. He sat at his kitchen table, the black device sitting between a half-empty sugar bowl and a chipped mug. As the sun began to bleed through the clouds, he looked closer. The object was warm. Not the warmth of a device that had been running, but a steady, radiating heat. He noticed a small recessed port on the side, barely visible to the naked eye. He remembered his nephew, a boy who built his own computers, talking about high-frequency signals and passive interception. Elias wasn't a man of science, but he was a man of observation. He spent his life watching how things fit together, how people moved, and how patterns emerged in the chaos of a crowded airport. He realized that the ventilation grate where he found the device wasn't just any grate. It was positioned exactly 8 feet from the secure communication booth used by the Israeli delegation during their monthly security summits. He felt a sudden cold prickle at the base of his neck. He walked to the window and looked down at the street. A dark sedan was idling near the fire hydrant. It was a common sight, yet today it felt deliberate. The driver wasn't looking at a phone or a map. He was looking at the entrance of the apartment building. Elias stepped back from the glass. He thought about the men he saw in the airport, the ones who didn't fly, who didn't carry bags, who spent hours nursing a single cup of tea in the transit zone. He remembered a group of 3 men who had passed him near the diplomatic lounge 2 nights ago. They spoke Farsi, a low, melodic murmur that he only recognized because the airport was a tapestry of languages. They had the posture of soldiers dressed in civilian clothes, the way they checked their peripheries without moving their heads. He picked up the device and turned it over. In the morning light, he saw a faint indentation on the bottom. It looked like a seal, a tiny, stylized emblem of a bird. He had seen that emblem before, on a news report about regional intelligence networks. It was the mark of a specific technical wing of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's intelligence apparatus. He wasn't just holding a piece of lost property. He was holding a piece of a silent war. The device was an acoustic-to-digital bridge, designed to pick up the vibrations of voices through the glass and walls of the secure booth and transmit them via a burst signal to a receiver nearby. It was a sophisticated piece of espionage, something that should have been invisible to everyone. But the engineers in Tehran hadn't accounted for Elias. They hadn't accounted for the man who mops the floors and knows every inch of the building better than the architects. The panic didn't come all at once. It seeped in like the dampness of the city.
Elias realized that the device was likely still transmitting his location. If it could hear through walls, it could certainly tell its masters where it was. He thought about going to the police, but who would believe a cleaner? He could see the scene in his mind. The bored desk sergeant, the long wait in a plastic chair, the skeptical questions. By the time they understood what he had, the men in the sedan would have already come up the stairs. He looked at his small room, the photos of his sisters in the countryside, the worn rug. His quiet life was suddenly a fragile thing. He decided he couldn't stay. He put the device in a thick wool sock to muffle any sound it might be picking up, and then placed it inside a lead-lined film bag he had found in the airport's Lost and Found years ago. He left through the back service entrance, moving through the alleyways where the trash was piled high. He felt the weight of the city pressing down on him. Every footstep behind him sounded like a pursuit. Every stranger in a raincoat looked like an operative. He realized then that espionage isn't about explosions or high-speed chases. It's about the erosion of the ordinary. It's the way a familiar street becomes a labyrinth of threats. He made his way to a small, nondescript electronics repair shop owned by a man named Maya. Maya was a veteran, a man who had served in the Israeli Air Force decades ago, before settling into a life of fixing broken radios and soldering motherboards.
He was a man of few words and deep memories. When Elias walked in, the bell above the door chimed with a lonely sound. Maya looked up from a tangle of wires, his magnifying loupe still attached to his forehead. Elias didn't say hello. He simply reached into the film bag and placed the black object on the glass counter. Maya didn't touch it at first. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he adjusted the loop. The shop grew very still. Outside, the sound of a passing bus shook the windows. Maya reached for a pair of plastic tweezers and slowly turned the device over. He saw the bird emblem. He saw the violet pulse. His hands, usually as steady as a surgeon's, gave a small, involuntary tremor. He looked up at Elias, and for the first time in years, Elias saw fear in another man's eyes. Not the fear of a thief, but the profound unease of someone who recognizes a monster. Naya spoke in a whisper, telling Elias that this was a passive interceptor of a type that had only been rumored in intelligence circles. It was designed to bypass encryption by capturing raw data before it was even processed. It was a tool of the Iranian intelligence ministry, specifically used for high-value targets. If it was at the airport, it meant they were tracking the movements of the Israeli intelligence officers who frequently traveled through that hub. The device was a link in a chain that stretched from the streets of this city all the way back to the shadow offices in Tehran.
Maya explained that the device wasn't just a listener, it was a beacon. The men in the sedan weren't just watching Elias, they were waiting for the right moment to retrieve their property and eliminate the witness. Elias felt a strange calm settle over him. It was the calm of a man who has already seen the end of the story. He asked Maya what they should do. Maya didn't answer immediately. He walked to the back of the shop and pulled out a heavy steel box. He placed the device inside and locked it. He then made a phone call, speaking in rapid Hebrew. He wasn't calling the police. He was calling a number that didn't appear in any directory. Within 20 minutes, 2 men arrived. They didn't wear uniforms, and they didn't identify themselves. They looked like businessmen on a lunch break, but their eyes were like flint. They took the steel box, and one of them spent a long time looking at Elias. He didn't thank him. He simply asked Elias to describe exactly where he found it, the time, and the people he had seen in the transit lounge over the last 3 days. Elias walked back to the airport that evening. The rain had stopped, but the air was still cold and biting. He went through the security checkpoint, his badge beeping with its usual dull tone. He changed into his jumpsuit and picked up his mop. As he entered the diplomatic lounge, he saw that the ventilation grate had been replaced. The carpet had been steam cleaned.
There was no trace of the device, no trace of the click, and no trace of the violet pulse. The world had returned to its state of artificial perfection. But as he moved through the terminal, he saw things differently. He saw the way the cameras were angled, not to catch shoplifters, but to monitor the shadows. He saw the way certain travelers paused for a fraction of a second too long at the entrance of the secure zones. A few days later, the news carried a small, inconspicuous story about a diplomatic incident. 2 members of a foreign mission had been quietly expelled for activities incompatible with their status. There were no details, no mentions of devices or airport cleaners. It was a footnote in the grand theatre of international relations. But Elias knew. He knew that for a few hours he had been the most important man in the building. He had found the flaw in the machine. He realized that the greatest secrets don't hide in vaults or encrypted servers. They hide in the corners that no one bothers to clean. They hide in the mundane spaces where the invisible people work. He continued his shifts, his mop making its rhythmic swish across the tiles. He stayed invisible. But sometimes, when the terminal was at its quietest, he would look at the ventilation grates. He would listen for a click that shouldn't be there. He realized that the war wasn't fought with tanks and planes, but with silence and observation.
The enemies of his world were always there, moving in plain sight, blending into the routine, waiting for a moment of distraction. He was no longer just a cleaner. He was a sentinel. He understood that the peace of the terminal was an illusion, a thin veneer over a deep and restless ocean of conflict. And as he pushed his mop towards the next gate, he felt the weight of the sock in his pocket. Not the device itself, but the memory of its heat. It was a reminder that even in the most ordinary life, the darkness is only a heartbeat away. He looked out the great glass windows at the planes taking off into the night. They looked like stars, distant and bright, carrying people towards their destinations, oblivious to the silent currents beneath them. He thought of the men in Tehran, the men in the sedan, and the men who took the steel box. They were all part of a game that would never truly end. The device he found was just one of thousands, scattered like seeds across the globe. He realized that the world was full of these invisible threats, and that for every one found by a man like him, 100 more remained hidden. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a spy. He was simply a man who had learned how to see. The terminal hummed. A child cried in the distance. A janitor's cart rattled across the floor. Elias lowered his head and kept working. He knew that the most dangerous thing in the world isn't a bomb or a bullet. It's the detail that doesn't fit the pattern.
It's the click in the silence. It's the pulse in the dark. And as long as there were people who ignored the man with the mop, there would always be a way for the truth to be found. He reached the end of the hall and turned around, looking back at the long, polished path he had made. It was clean, it was empty, and it was perfect. But Elias knew better. He knew that even on the cleanest floor, there are shadows that no mop can ever truly reach. He looked at the central clock. It was nearly 5 a.m. He reached into his pocket, took out a small piece of chalk, and hesitated. Then he put it back. Not tonight. Tonight the world was still, but he would keep his eyes open. He would keep his ears tuned to the hum of the machines, because in the heart of the airport, where the world meets and parts, the silence is never as empty as it seems. He walked toward the service elevator, his reflection following him in the polished chrome doors. He looked tired, older than his years, but there was a new sharpness in his gaze. He understood now that he was part of the architecture in a way he had never imagined. He was the filter through which the world's debris passed, and sometimes that debris was the only thing that could save a life. He stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the basement. As the doors closed, cutting off the light of the terminal, he felt a strange sense of belonging. He was the man who cleared the stage for the next day's performance.
He was the one who knew the secrets of the dust, and in the silent, moving box of the elevator, he allowed himself a small, grim smile. The world was still full of invisible threats, but for now, at least, one of them had been silenced. The darkness outside the glass was fading into a pale, cold blue. Another day was beginning. Another thousands of feet would scuff his floors, and another cycle of secrets would begin to circulate. He would be there, waiting, with his mop and his quiet observations, the most dangerous man in the airport, because he was the only one who truly saw the things that everyone else chose to ignore. The city was waking up, the trains were starting their rounds, and the sedan was gone from the hydrant. But the memory of the violet pulse remained, a tiny, steady heartbeat in the back of his mind, reminding him that the quiet is always temporary, and the invisible is always watching. He walked out into the morning air, the scent of the bakery waiting for him, and for a moment, the weight of the world felt almost manageable. He was just a cleaner, after all, and a cleaner's work is never done. The threats remain, tucked away in the grates and the bins, waiting for a moment of neglect. But as long as the floors were mopped and the vents were checked, there was a chance, a small, silent chance, that the patterns could be broken and the monsters could be kept at bay. Elias climbed the stairs to his apartment, his footsteps heavy but certain. He would sleep for a few hours, and then he would return to the terminal. He would return to the silence. He would return to the shadows, because the world is a dangerous place, and someone has to keep it clean. In the end, it wasn't the high-tech sensors or the satellite surveillance that caught the trail. It was the man who noticed that the world had a slightly different sound.
It was the man who realized that even the most sophisticated intelligence is ultimately vulnerable to the simple, patient persistence of a human being doing their job. The device was gone, the network was exposed, and the mission had failed. Not because of a counter-spy or a double agent, but because of a microfiber mop and a man who spent too much time in the silence. Elias closed his eyes and drifted into a dreamless sleep, while somewhere across the world, in a room full of screens and maps, a name was being crossed out in red. The game would continue, but for one night, the ordinary had triumphed over the extraordinary, and the world remained a place of secrets, waiting for the next person to look just a little bit closer at the things that were meant to be hidden in plain sight.